I think to answer that question, you just have to consider the situation. We have Russian forces moved close to the Ukrainian border. We have NATO forces, additional NATO forces being deployed in Eastern Europe. We have almost no communication between NATO military forces and Russian military forces whilst they come up very close to each other. And we have a range of frozen conflicts in the region which could broaden the confrontation with Russia out further if there was a flare-up in Georgia or some such incident. So it's quite a combustible mix. And it's worth remembering that there are thousands of nuclear weapons also on short notice to fire in the region. And I think that all makes it quite a dangerous situation.
Yes, and what danger is there exactly?
Well, one would hope that nobody would be crazy enough to start a NATO-Russia military confrontation by design. But the concern is really, at the moment, about starting a military conflict by accident or unintentionally. Just some weeks ago, there was an incident in which a Russian warplane came up 12 times very close to a US warship, the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea. Thankfully, the USS Donald Cook didn't shoot that plane down. But if it had, because it feared it was under threat, then we may have been into an escalation scenario. And that's what we need to avoid.
Okay, so you say an incident can unintendedly lead to a war.
Well, I don't think I have to tell anybody in the Netherlands how an unintended incident with regard to MH17 has now triggered a whole wave of fresh economic sanctions against Russia and a whole new phase of the crisis. And MH17, although that was an appalling incident, particularly for the families affected, it's the case, I'm afraid, that the MH17 is not the worst thing that could happen in this crisis moving forward. We could see direct military engagements with the potential for escalation. So that is a serious concern. And the ministers who published the report by the European Leadership Network today from across Europe, including Russia, are expressing that concern and saying we need to take steps to avoid it.
Yes, what kind of steps?
Well, one of the practical things we need to do is to increase military-to-military exchanges of information. It may seem a strange suggestion to many people who are not close to defence issues, but actually if we can get the Russian military and NATO militaries communicating with each other more about where their forces are and what they're doing, that would be in the interests of both parties, because it would reduce fear and suspicion, and it would reduce the likelihood that people would take rash decisions because they fear they're about to be subject to an attack. Some people say that's a naive recommendation, but one also, I think, has to ask how President Putin would have felt had the United States warship shot down that Russian warplane just a few weeks ago. He himself would have been facing a very difficult decision on what to do next. Then we need, I think, some exercise of political restraint, not just on the part of Russia and countries elsewhere in the region, but we need Russia and countries in the West to exercise all their influence to make sure that frozen conflicts in places like Moldova, Transnistria and Georgia don't flare up unintentionally due to some local activity of local actors on the ground. That could widen the confrontation with Russia beyond Ukraine and make the whole situation much worse. So we need political restraint as well. And then lastly, we need some serious political dialogue. We need some serious political dialogue on the issues with which we fundamentally disagree with Russia. Sadly, at the moment, we're closing down most channels of dialogue when we should be trying to maintain them.
Is dialogue possible with Mr. Putin at this moment? It seems he promises one thing and acts the other way.
I agree, and I think the way to get dialogue with Mr. Putin is not just to ask him for dialogue. I think we need to, the economic sanctions are an important element of this. We also, in my opinion, need to provide further military assistance, logistics assistance and intelligence assistance to the Ukrainian military forces. We need to escalate Putin's costs, not with a view to defeating him, but with a view to bringing him to the negotiating table so that some serious dialogue can take place. Being in favour of dialogue doesn't, I think, make one naive. One can be quite robust in response to Russia, but at the end of the day, Russia exists. Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia, and sooner or later we have to talk with Putin and with other leaders in Russia about how we're going to move the relationship forward from here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kearns.